Welcome, and you can take a seat. Thank you. Vale.
All right, let's get started. Welcome. Welcome all to the site event, Rethinking Access to University, framed within the World Higher Education Conference by UNESCO in 2022. Since Caixa, the education area from the Caixa Foundation, we want to thank Catesco for organizing this side event, a space for discussion that we believe is necessary to think about the future of the access to university. We also wanted to thank the presence of this wonderful team of panelists. 3 of them only just landed from New York, Anne Cook and Professor Michelle Fine. Thank you for coming all the way from New York just to be here with us today. And we also have with us from Chile, Professor Alvaro Gonzalez, to talk about how they're transforming access to university from his reality. On the local level, we also have wonderful people from the field of universities, government, and education, and we thank the presence of Abuelo, Catarina Casalmiña, and Joan Telpi. From La Caixa Foundation, and especially from La Caixa, we want to organize debates to reflect on methods, methodologies, and the impact of academic evaluation systems. We believe it is essential. But we think it's important to question how these impact the most vulnerable students and the educational system of equity of the system that we share, as well as deep thought on the effects that it may have on students at large. We also believe we need to have a discussion on how these systems that are of a more pragmatic nature, student selections into university degrees, have an academic impact in the previous pedagogic stages to university access exams. Besides, the choice of the theme for today's discussion is also fruit of the context we're living in today, as well as the worry by professors and the education community. Myself, when I was a high school student, it was often interesting when we had staff discussions to see how this university access exams affected learning or made difficult to have innovation or different methodologies. So we believe it is quite a privilege to be able to have this wonderful panel to work hand in hand with the educational community in this discussion process. So without further ado, Eduard, you have the word, so you can moderate today's panels with our panelists, whose presence I deeply thank. All right, well, thank you. I just wanted to give you a brief context. Catalan universities, and in many European countries. Oh, okay, that means this isn't working, right? So I'll start again. Schools, high schools, and universities in Catalonia, Spain, Europe, and many other countries in the world are thinking about how the filter to access university negatively impacts the quality of learning, of education in the high school stage, as well as equity of access from people who come from non-privileged backgrounds into university. What we want to try to do today is mostly have a discussion on how this thing that seems like a little cog in the system is highly relevant. And we will do so with a panel of experts in this particular area, with Alvaro, David, and Catarina, who from very different disciplines, from education, neuroscience, and social sciences, economy, have been analyzing how can we move this filter to access university towards different models. And we will also do so with representatives from the Catalan Ministry for Education and the Inter-University Council.
With a great example on how things could be radically different. And this is the example of the New York Performance Standards Consortium and its alliance with City University of New York. It's been a while since I had the luck and the privilege of knowing Anne and many of the schools of the consortium through Pedro Noguera, who told me this is something that is going to blow your mind, and he was right. those schools, those high schools, have shown how transforming the way you assess impacts radically, both on the learnings happening in kids, on the expectations on how challenging learning could be, and also on how universities could find a very different way to select kids that standardize tests. So Anne Cook is the executive director of this consortium, and Michelle Fine is professor at City University of New York, and for many years had been monitoring the evidences created by the consortium, and also the bridging this or creating this pilot that had shown in very few years how powerful a transformation of this little wall in the entrance to university could be. So, ladies, the floor is yours. I think that it's my macro that doesn't work.
I guess you can hear me? Can everybody hear me? Okay. So thank you very much for, Eduardo, thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for coming and being here. And I hope that we can, in a quick way, give you some sense of what this program is about. The Consortium is a group of schools that, they got the wrong, it's the wrong thing, hold on.
Can you go back to
okay, we got it.
We got it.
Okay, so it's a group of schools that has developed an assessment system that is not test-driven. New York, as well as other states in the country, have tests that are used for graduation, that is to get your diploma and move on to university or college or the world of work. And the Consortium is a group of schools that, because of some political work 25 years ago, really, we were given permission to develop a system of assessment that did not rely on testing. And we say in our argument that learning is complex and assessment should be too. So I don't know why, is it coming up on this monitor
No,
here?
I guess not.
Okay. Well, okay, I mean, we've started in the 90s and in the early 90s, and it was a system that we developed in a group of schools, a small group of schools at first, and we developed things called rubrics that are still used and are revised by teachers. There's a presentation involved, there's student work that involves a lot of writing and performance assessments, and there are indications now that we've been in it for a long time that these are high schools that not only have changed their system of assessment, but it has affected, which is what we hoped, the curriculum, the instruction, and the culture of the schools. Because so many schools and so many of the experiences of our students in the States are test-driven, to have a system that doesn't rely on that really works from work that students are doing, I think has been very important. And these are some of the central components of our assessment system. We say that there are rubrics that are system-wide. That is, all the schools use the same rubrics. And the tasks, while they're the same, there's a task in English, math, science, and social studies. But what the task is about, the topic, that is student-driven. So we say it's a student-focused program that's practitioner-developed and externally assessed. And so there is a lot of professional development. That's one of the keys. And there is predictive validity that's based on college success, which you'll hear about from Michelle. The teaching that we push for in the schools is inquiry-based teaching and learning, in which students are engaged and participants, and student voice is a central part of the teaching, so discussion is the main mode of instruction. And as I said, discussion-based. So there are some demographics, just very, very few that I've given you here. We want to show that we are in some ways dealing with a more challenged population than the city as a whole. And so we're looking at the English language learners, for example. We have 5 schools that have English language learners entirely. These are kids who do not speak English when they come to the country for 4 years or less, and they have failed the English proficiency test. So we have more kids in temporary housing, And we have the most important from the point of view of the authorities, unfortunately, what the scores are like when the kids come in from their previous school, the junior high school or the middle school, and these are kids who score below the city average, so it's important to compare that with what happens later on. These are some of the attributes where there are opportunities for students to demonstrate what they know and can do, which is the central theme here. So it involves open-ended questions in classes. They're not a heavy use of textbooks at all. A lot of teacher-developed curriculum. There are multiple ways for kids to show what they've learned. There are a lot of in-depth work that we favor over sort of going a mile deep instead of a mile wide. And they can do performances, they can do papers, they can do poetry, and they, in order to do what we call the PBATs, which is for graduation, it starts when they're freshmen, when they enter high school, and they begin to do writing, a lot more reading, a lot more doing science, not just reading science, doing problem solving in math, doing analytic papers in English, and doing research papers in the social sciences. And so we would be trying to build a culture of revision so that students just do one paper, or they do many papers, and they get feedback from their teachers. And at the end, when they've submitted the work and it's been approved, then written work, then they do an oral presentation. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So there are many ways that students can develop, can demonstrate their proficiency. They can do problem solving, critical thinking, creative performance, communication, collaboration, so on. And so there are the tasks, which, as I mentioned, are in the 4 subjects, and then schools add on to the requirements. So we require, there's a problem solving in math, there's social studies, there's a text-based research that is required, literature and science, and then there's supplemental PBATs, which the schools add on. So there are native languages for schools that are dealing with international students. The arts is very important. Most of the schools have extensive internships or community service. There are, as I mentioned, these rubrics that are system-wide. So they are not set in stone. We try to revise them in groups of teachers. It's a collaborative activity. At least a couple times, about every other year, a group of teachers will come together. We use these rubrics when we're looking at the final product, the PBAT work, and they are what contribute to our moderation studies. These are studies where we bring teachers together from all our schools. Work is submitted from all our schools across the disciplines. The names of the schools, the names of the teachers are taken off, and they're regraded by groups of teachers that are not the teachers of the schools, of the papers that they're reading. And then that review and what comments there are goes back to the schools that they came from. Now, what's interesting is that we also evaluate the course work, the requirement, the assignment that produced the work. So we're not just looking at the student product, we're also looking at the assignment that produced, in a particular case, it produced that particular piece of work. And as I say to people all the time, it's because a couple of teachers at one of the moderation studies, one year read a paper and said, you know, it's a good mediocre paper. And what they meant was the paper had a lot of the qualities that you look for, but the topic wasn't particularly interesting, and they wanted to know what the assignment was. And so we began to look at the assignments, and that we use a rubric that's developed by Norman Webb, who's developed a whole depth of knowledge way of looking at teachers' assignments. And that's proved to be very useful and interesting and feeds into the professional development that we do to create new curriculum and assignments that come out of that curriculum. So this is kind of a view.
I Prep Academy. I'm
this is a math presentation of a student, which I'll explain after.
I presented my math PBAT. It is called Will You Remain Standing? And the name of the problem is The Last Person Standing. And it's essentially, I guess you could imagine a group of people in a circle. what you do is you go around a circle, and as you go, you take away every other person in the circle. So, for example, if we're standing here in a group of 4, I say that I stay inside, I'll take you out of the circle, you stay inside, I'll take you out of the circle, I stay inside, and you take out of the circle. At one point, we're going to get to 1 person, and that will be the winner.
So I've got a question based on you talked a lot about your patterns. So if you were number 121, so in the circle, if you're the 121st person,
okay,
and you wanted to be the last person standing, how many people would you need in the circle in order for that to be the case?
121. I would have to do the math. You did it quick.
Yeah, just good.
Thank you.
I pose that question because there isn't a way, based on the formulas or the equations that he developed in his paper, that question could be answered. But there's a pattern in his table that could help him answer that.
So essentially, if it's a power of 2, the rule keeps going, because if it's a power of 2, it divides by 2 multiple times until you get to the first person standing. But if you don't have a power of 2, it doesn't. It changes the rule at one point. That's why it's so complicated if you just give me a number to find it, because I need to like go through the process of the closest power of 2, which I don't know. That's why I'm trying to find it here.
Yeah.
Cool.
So that was a math defense. All of the tasks have oral components, so that once a student has finished the written work, in this case, working on the problem that you saw, they have to present it and defend it before a committee of external assessors. And the external assessors can question them, and should question them, about not the specific problem or paper or topic, but an extension of that, so that you can see whether students are able to use the approach, the information, the questions that they had. And in this case, the math outsider posed a question to the student about how to work out an extension of the problem. And it was a challenge, and he did come through very well. And it's an extremely important event in the life of the students. And I think they go on to university able to do a lot more being a public person and presenting themselves in classes because of the kind of practice they have in preparing for this. I think that very often schools will kind of tweak the oral presentation. So for example, one of the schools uses a slightly different approach in the English language arts, where we're looking for analytic reading and writing. They use a technique where they ask the students to select a book, piece of fiction, that the student has not studied in a class, independent reading. So the student would read the book, and if they don't like the titles that have been presented, they can come up with another one. It has to be approved by a faculty committee. And then they would develop questions, things that puzzle them, things that they're concerned about or that they have some disagreement with. And they would raise those with this external assessor, who we have a whole bunch of people who like doing it. It includes a bunch of lawyers, it includes journalists, writers, people who really like books, who want to talk to teenagers. And we train them. And then it's a completely unscripted experience for the student. They go and meet the person in an office or a coffee shop and discuss this book for half an hour, 45 minutes. And then the person, the outside assessor, reviews it and reports to the person at the school. And I think over the years, we've done this now for a very long time. It's a very, very important experience for the kids, because first of all, they realize they can talk to somebody they don't know about a book. The person who's doing it, I think we've had a lot of really good feedback, because most of the reviewers say they've never talked to their own child about a book for 30 minutes or 45. And it gives them a different view of teenagers. You know, they think, oh my goodness, this teenager really can have something to say. And I think that's important. And it's important for the consortium, because we've built a kind of reservoir of goodwill among a lot of people that are not normally associated with schools. So as I say, each of the disciplines has a rubric, and as I said, they are revised. They do not deal with specific information content. They deal with dispositions and attitudes and ways of working. So there's a social studies, there's a math. And these, as I said, groups of teachers come together every other year practically to revise or look at, review the particular rubric in their discipline. And these rubrics become the basis for the moderation studies that we do, where we have the regrading process. They are used, this is what is used to check to see whether the school and the graders who graded the student, whether they are in agreement. And that information goes back to the school. So the outcomes are better than the schools that we are in, the city. Our graduation rates and our college readiness rates that the Department of New York City reports, we're higher. We have better success with our English language learners and children with special needs. Some of our schools have 30% and upwards of special needs students. Their college enrollment, the minority male data, which you'll hear about from Michelle. Teacher professionalism, I think there's a tremendous amount of training and workshops that are teacher initiated, a lot of building of new curriculum, a lot of review of studies that are done that might be relevant to teachers' performance. I think the level of student engagement, the board does surveys of student attitudes, and we come out way ahead on that. Teacher retention, and we have done follow-ups with graduates about what the experience has meant to them once they're in college, and even some that are finished with college. And the academic courses that we teach, a number of them are specially selected to be college preparatory. We're not asking for credit for the colleges, we ask college faculty to review the course syllabus to see whether they think the readings, the assignments, the expectations for the students are what would really help prepare them for college work. There's a clarity of goals, which is why I think it works. We're clear why we're doing what we're doing. We have an outside board of people who come in to review a school about every 5 years. They come in and do a thorough review of the PBATs in a school. It's a school-based review process. When we compare our schools with other schools in the same district, we have come out doing pretty well. The moderation study shows reliability, and the college study is giving us some insights into predictability. So I'm going to stop and just say that's kind of an overview of what we're doing and how we do it. And I'm going to turn it over to Michelle to talk about our relationship with the college.
Edward, do you want to do a little, or afterwards? Okay, good. Well, thank you, Anne. Okay, we're on the next slideshow, PowerPoint, maybe. Hey, everybody, I'm Michelle. I teach at City University of New York. And at some point, a few years ago, Anne and colleagues got together to talk about college. College going, college access for their graduates. So at that point, they were kind of where you are. So they had already decided that the school culture, the high school culture, was going to shift. I know they were about 20 years further down the road. I'm looking at you, Susanna. And I know you are just embarking on that project. But in some ways, you're more precocious, because you're saying, how do we think about college at the same time? It took us 20 years to figure out that we needed a more fluid process between the gorgeous work that was happening in these schools and the City University, which is the major university in New York, where lots of New York City graduates go, that there was a disconnect, a radical, complicated disconnect between the performance-based work and then the entrance criteria for CUNY, which was test-driven and thereby excluded large numbers of students of color, low-income students, immigrant students. So when they had this meeting of their college advisors, the college advisors said, our kids are doing great. They're graduating, they're getting into private universities, but the only place where it looks like there's a problem is at the City University of New York, which was appalling to me because I had been teaching at an elite private university, University of Pennsylvania, and I chose to come to CUNY because it is the people's university for all of the children of all of the city of New York. And then I realized that we were using these, what you would call selective admission strategies that had deep consequences by race, by class, by disability, and by immigration status. So Anne and her colleagues and I and my colleagues got together with the university and we said, let's create a pilot. Universities aren't scared of pilots. They're scared of transformation. But let's start with a pilot. If the consortium schools could identify a set of students who would not otherwise get into the four-year colleges. Does this make sense? Yeah? We will vet them, the colleges. We will submit their student work, look at their PBETs, appreciate their work, and then Michelle and colleagues will track them quantitatively. So we kind of cut a deal. Give us an option for a more equitable, just, intellectually inquiry-based assessment system for entrance, and we'll go with transparency in making visible how are they doing. If they all bomb out, you win. Tests are great. If they do well, we have a collective obligation to rethink not only what we do in high schools, but how we allow students into the university. Because there, as here, university access has huge consequences for social mobility, economic mobility, health, criminal justice, social justice, activism, democracy, people's being exposed to new ideas. So we decided to do a longitudinal study of the graduates of the consortium schools who entered CUNY. Kind of with me? Now, lots of them don't go to CUNY. Lots of them go elsewhere. And maybe it's fair to say some of the better students, academic, go elsewhere. If they can leave the city, leave their families. It's not so easy for working class kids. They often want to or have to stay home, take care of grandma, little kids, mom has cancer, brothers deported, sisters going to prison. Life is complicated, so leaving isn't an option for many. All right, so we did this study. Chung. Did I do it? Yeah. So now you know the history of the schools. So you know that there are 38 schools, about 30,000 students. And as Anne indicated, this is very important. They are, the schools are diverse, but they represent more of the marginalized students in New York City than the citywide average. So this is not a selective process. Is it moving? All right. So what, back.
Okay.
You were so good at this.
Yeah.
I'm envious. Yeah. All right. Oh, they're all different. That's part of the problem. Okay. So what we did was we've tracked them over time. So we now have 4 years of data. The first year, like 8 kids came. Second year, like 30. Now it's going nuts. And then after that, so we have about 1,000 students. I'm going to do it again, but I won't get panicky. Let's see. This is still the consortium. And this is very important because consortium students graduate at a higher rate than New York City. But maybe what we haven't told you is that they come in at an academic disadvantage. So something, for those of you in high school, something amazing is happening in the schools, and they're more likely to go to college. All right, now we're going to college, I think. So here we have the number of students who are at CUNY by borough, by race, ethnicity. It's just going to keep moving. So the consortium students at CUNY are blacker, more Latinx, and more likely from the Bronx. You all know the Bronx? Do you have a stereotype? It's wrong, but they are poorer than the rest of the city. They are blacker than the rest of the city, more Latino, more young people who are homeless or precariously housed. So many more risky, I don't like that language, students coming into CUNY from the consortium. This is, she already said that. So this is how wonderfully, this is how it happened. I'm trying to get to the data. A pilot is born. So we had two questions. One is, how do students educated in the consortium with performance assessments fare over time in terms of college persistence, grade point average, credit accumulation, and graduation? And then we disaggregated the data by race, ethnicity, and language. And then how do consortium students in the pilot, who again came in with lower expectations, back to your selectivity, how do they fare in the system? So they were vetted by the college advisors, then they were reviewed at CUNY. I'm happy to talk to university folks about how you have to rethink your selection process. CUNY had to purchase a computer platform so that students could submit their PBATs, their student work. And we said earlier, assessment and admissions counselors were reading the PBATs and just so excited about the work students were doing. Usually you get all the applications and you divide them into high test scores and low, and you never look at the low again. Here, they got this work, and they discovered that Laura was interested in Mexican dance and literature and poetry. Well, they might not known that about Laura if she got a 480 and never even got looked at. So the admissions counselors kind of fell in love with these students. And they have argued that less money should be spent on the data infrastructure of universities and more on folks to read these, take seriously the quality of student work, and think about where to place these students. All right, so in year one, or you can see the numbers. So the percentage admitted was usually has now stabilized to about 70%. So the university did not take everybody that they sent. Then of those admitted, the yield was between 50 and 60%, the percentage of students who came in. This is 1 year retention. At a school like CUNY City University, many kids are gone by the end of the first semester. So we looked at the first year retention, and what we found was that the consortium had an 83%, all of New York City publics had an 87%, but this pilot, that is the uncredentialed kids with lousy scores, had a 94% retention rate. We then looked at credit accumulation. The same patterns are emerging, that the consortium students are basically like the rest of the publics, and the pilots, the ones who are vetted despite the low scores, are surpassing. We then looked at GPA, grade point average, same deal, pilot a little higher. We then looked at black male graduation rates. In the US, African American males have the highest dropout or push-out rate. The persistent rates are low. And what we found, compared to New York City public schools, where 78% were retained after the first year, the consortium was almost 90%, and that included the pilots. So I reference this as the consortium bump is particularly high for students who would be most marginalized in their traditional high schools. Does that make sense? I'm seeing some nods, so I'm taking that as a yes. And that finding has done us well politically, right? So people are interested in, do you have a retention strategy that will increase access but also retain quality, right? Because you'll get attacked for low standards. So we're able to say the best evidence is how did they do after they graduate? And how did they do after they graduate when you know they're already from a marginalized group? And so we feel like we've given them kind of insurance against the newspaper headlines that are waiting to say you lowered standards, they're just allowing anybody to go to college these days, where is tradition? Same deal, these are black males' grade point average. So there are implications for higher ed, and I'm just going to go through these and then I'll stop. In the US, many elite white universities are doing away with high-stakes tests. And public universities that are still serving disproportionately poor kids, working class, kids of color, are holding on to these tests. And so what we've got is stratified multiply, COVID, college access, economics. But you get white elite kids kind of invited into universities for their capacity and to imagine what's possible. And then you get working class kids, kids of color, kind of choked at the bottom of the educational hierarchy by tests that are obstacles across their academic career. So this provides a kind of natural experiment on equity, access, and higher education achievement. We produced this report. You can get it online if you're really interested in all the statistics. The Learning Policy Institute is run by Linda Darling-Hammond. They're the ones who commissioned the report. And I usually do qualitative work, but I love having this evidence. I have to say, it speaks to other audiences. And I love having it without tests, that one can look at the consequences of an assessment system in terms of life outcomes without backing into high-stakes tests. And interestingly, even conservative think tanks are finding these alternatives appealing. Most recently, New York State, which creates the regents, has gotten interested in expanding the schools who would be organized like the consortium. And there, like here, it's a political debate between people who say, we need creative thinkers, we need problem solvers, we need transdisciplinary social analysts, we need young people who love themselves and are interested in other people. We need young people who are civic agents and activists. That's one crowd. And we need an assessment system that cultivates that. And the other crowd is funded by the testing industry, which is very much an industry in the United States, holding on to very conservative notions that the university should only work with the most elite and gifted, which in our country means whitest and wealthiest. Gifted is not the word. But one of the good things of COVID, there aren't many good things about COVID, but one thing about COVID is it revealed the inequities and it halted the tests. And so now we've had 2 years of universities across the board accepting kids without high-stakes tests. And nothing terrible has happened. So CUNY is now interested in accepting student work in their admissions. Other universities and the state are interested in expanding the consortium. And they're most interested in the question, I think, one of the questions you're posing, which is how do you take an already existing school and transition it to this very different way of building curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment? And then how do we transform universities really so they are worthy of the work that's coming out of these schools? I'm going to stop there, and we can open for questions. Thank you.
We have a little bit of time for questions, thoughts, clarifications. Maybe we could take two or three people. Who has the micro?
You had it.
No, I have this one, but for him, excellent, yeah. Thank you. Aquí.
This better be a good question. Can you hear him? Not yet.
¿Funciona? Sí. Mira.
Okay, just to understand the problems, I have a couple of questions I wanted to ask. So that's CUNY. In its structure, is it like a community college?
It's a two-part question. Go ahead.
But you are only handling the data from high schools for the community college. From CUNY.
Of high schools or of undergraduate degrees?
Undergraduate degrees. Undergraduates. But we excluded the community college for this analysis. But when we include the community college students, we're finding that the consortium students are so drastically overperforming that we're now encouraging the advisors maybe not to make so many recommendations for community colleges. But this was for the 4-year colleges. Sorry if that was confusing.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Any other question? ¿Algo vol... Gracias. ¿Algún comentario?
How about thoughts about your own circumstance and how it maps on or doesn't?
I think that maybe we could jump to the next round table because probably at the end they are going to be, because they are following exactly your path, and they are going to also react to your presentations.
Good.
Last time, alguna pregunta, any question? Algú té algú a dir? 3, 2, 1. Lot of pressure. Let's go. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Caterina Casamiglia, Alvaro Gonzalez.
I welcome Caterina Casamiglia, Alvaro Gonzalez, and David Bueno. You can now come on the stage. Caterina Casamiglia is a research professor at ICREA in political economy. She specializes in education. Alvaro is a professor at Magallanes University in Chile, And David Bueno is a genetics professor in Barcelona University and director on the neuroeducation seat. Since there are only 3 chairs, I'm going to sit here, and if you need me, just call. I think you can do your presentation and tie it together with the previous panel and whatever you have to say about it. And the floor is yours. Shall I start? Okay. Well, thank you. Can everyone hear me? I'm hearing a little echo. I'm sorry, I'm not used to this kind of hoo-ha. Thank you so much for inviting me to Catesco and the La Caixa Foundation to be able to share this panel. My name is Alvaro Gonzalez. I work in a public state university of the southern tip of Chile, in the Chilean Patagonia, Magallanes University. And the first thing I wanted to tell you is that the presentation of the New York experience allows us to refocus the discussion on the sense, the meaning of education, and on what it means to have enough merits to go to university, which is something that's being hotly debated in Chile right now. But this presentation also makes us question the fact that if there is so much evidence worldwide that standardized testing highly correlates with cultural capital and economic capital, and it would seem that it doesn't answer to the requirements for the education for the 21st century, well, why aren't we seeing more massive different approaches to the admissions process? And I think part of the answer lies in the fact that standardized texting is a lot cheaper and easy to apply. And obviously part of the answer also lies in that there's an important sector in the academy world, in academia, that has defended and is still argues for the mismatch hypothesis. That opening up universities and selective degrees to students that historically have been excluded would put them almost in a situation of surefire failure because of their lack of academic preparation and social and psychological preparation that they have. We, and when I say we, is there's many people in Chile, and we have some representatives of that area, defend quite the opposite. We say that amplifying the opportunities to the least privileged students will guarantee that the great majority of these will take advantage of their potential to the fullest. And with some specific support in the transitional period towards university, they will be just as successful as any other student. I'm going to stop for a moment on the case of Chile, because I think it can be quite enlightening with regards to this debate. As in many other countries, Chile lives nowadays, for 20, 30 years, a great widening of university access. But it's a very unequal process of mass access to university. We are seeing now many more underprivileged students access universities, but the most selective universities and degrees are still co-opted by the elites. Which, even though Chile, starting in 2016, has made university absolutely free for the most poor percentiles, means that inequality in the access to these more selective universities and careers is not explained by financial barriers, but rather because of the academic selection criteria, which obviously become the most relevant source of exclusion of the students. In Chile, we have a standardized test to access university, which has had its name changed. And this test, beyond the limitations that it implies for school culture, because it reduces the curriculum to just learning for the test, they act as a true social filter. Some authors point out that this is a social selection disguised as an academic selection, merit-based, like social Darwinism. So we wonder what to do. And I hope I'm not boring you. we wonder what to do. And among other measures, we consider more and more strongly the grades in secondary educations because they're a better predictive for the future development of the student. They allow us to widen this access, and they generate much needed diversity in colleges. In Chile, we have what we call merit in context, which is a grade ranking with the relative position of the student with regards to graduates from his own school. And since there is great segregation within Chilean schools, so they're very different amongst themselves, but very homogeneous within each school, this measure seems to make the comparison between students a little more fair. This is obviously an incomplete advancement because it doesn't do away with standardized testing, but it does take into account the student's trajectory to admissions process. So it is something. We also have a different access, which has been called inclusive access, which allow students that complete a special preparatory course during their high school education will access universities regardless of their scores on standardized texts. And these are various programs which all have in common the students' academic preparation, their social and emotional preparation, as well as their vocational preparation. And this is very relevant because it allows for a common world of two worlds that very hardly work together, which is schools and universities. And we thought that this is a response that is better suited to the question of how do we favor a fairer and equitable access to university. To sum up and just to finish, what we learned in Chile is that to favor quantitative assessments, you need to act in three different moments that are still interrelated. First, before access through high school education, obviously improving the student's academic preparation, but also offering plenty of information on the possibilities, on what there is to study. Because it might seem obvious, but no one can choose what they don't know. And obviously offering vocational orientation. What am I good at? What are my abilities? What are my competences? What could I work in the future? And schools could be doing this alone, but what we have also seen is that in order to achieve that, collaboration between school and university is virtuous, among other things, because they have an influence in elevating the expectations of students and teachers, which is key because expectations are at the key of decision-making processes for higher education. The second moment is the access itself, where we advocate reducing as much as possible the influence of standardized texting, evaluating the students' academic trajectory, and simplifying admissions process. And hopefully in the future we will have non-academic indicators, motivation, leadership, that may help us reflect more diverse talents than a test for maths, for language, for social sciences. And I think in this we have made great progress in Chile. In university, that's the third moment when the institution obviously needs to account for walking hand in hand in the student, favoring their social and academic integration, what some experts call the student's affiliation, and thus enable his perseverance, his adherence, and academic success. And this is just with regards of some of the things that I can tell you about Chile. And Eduard, if I can may ask some questions on the presentation of our colleagues from New York. If I understand correctly, what you're presenting is a teaching system based on inquiry, project-based, and problem-solving and research. And I understand that your teaching process is student-focused, led by the teachers, and assessed externally. And in your presentation, we saw that this system seems to have been very successful for the students' academic preparation, as well as the equity of the university, of the access to university. And it also fosters collaborative work among teachers, so it generates professional learning communities. And I have some questions with regards to that, thinking on how to apply it in countries like Chile, which are highly segregated, and extremely unequal. And my first question, because I work in teacher training, I direct a department of education where future teachers are trained. So my first question is, how do you prepare teachers for this shift in their teaching methodology? Because these methodologies are right now based on reading, on essay writing, discussions, oral presentations from the students. So how do you teachers prepare for that shift? I'm thinking of education universities, a change that could be radical. And my second question is, what is the role that institutions have or could have, institutions that train teachers? So up to what point is there a connection between this teaching universities and the work that you do? And my third question, and penultimate, how do you solve what from afar could be seen, the vast amount of human resources involved in this assessment and admissions project? Because it would look like there are so many people working on this. And how do you tackle, I don't know if that's something you've been accused on, but the possible accusation, thinking in the Chilean context of being subjective in your assessment program, thinking that the great laud that is given to standardized testing is the fact that it's objective. So how, these are the elements that I'm interested in knowing. And lastly, I have a comment. In Chile, we have an international high school called IB, and I have a feeling that it works a little bit like what you presented. Some students, some schools in Chile, they're usually private, middle or high class students. And when students prepare in this international high school, they say, this is so interesting, but so different from what I'm going. I go to maths class, to a classical maths class, and then I go to my IB English class, and it's two worlds apart, completely disconnected. And the other thing that happens is that it's a time investment and an investment of effort on the part of these students, where they're often left out of university because standardized testing that don't measure the same things. So they prepare this international high school because I know I will do well in university under it, and I risk not accessing university. Or should I do a classic preparation for standardized testing? I'm sorry, these were many questions, but this is all for me. Thank you very much for listening. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I just came here without having prepared anything. But basically, after listening to all the panelists, there's a series of thoughts that I had that have a lot to do with my own experience over the past few years. For those of you who don't know me, I have been coordinating biology in the university entry exam in university, with two small interruptions when my own children were doing the exam, and it was a bit, it didn't look very nice, very well, that daddy was giving his own children the biology exam. So in all, I've been doing this for 12 years. And over these 12 years, what we've been doing that really connects with everything that has been said is to incorporate different competences within biology. We actually got from our prior coordination team some beginnings that were already going in that direction. And what we did was basically just broaden them and consolidate these and it has been very well received, except for the first year, where you always hear critical voices, as is logical and healthy, obviously. But it has been received very well. For one reason, is that we no longer have any catalogs. What I mean is, often when we talk about standardized testing, what we're doing is a catalog of knowledge that students need to learn by heart, under the pretense And I was going to say exactly the same, that it's more objective. Yes, obviously, what is there more objective than a test, multiple choice test of 100 questions where wrong questions will deduct points, because then you ensure that students don't play into the luck factor. I don't know if this is more objective or not, because there are specialists in answering in these type of tests, and other people are not as good. But that doesn't mean that their knowledge is any less. I mean, they might even know more. Simply the pressure of one such test does them no good. What is the advantage of these competence-based assessments? To me, the great advantage is that they're not only assessing knowledge, which is good, and obviously knowledge needs to be there. Obviously, when we're talking about competence-based assessment, we're not talking that they're knowledge-free. Knowledge is also there. It's just not a catalog of knowledge. It's the way that this knowledge is applied in any context. To me, the great advantage is that this reflects life. Life isn't a catalog. And I'm speaking about biology. No one goes around asking you, what is a mitochondria? A mitochondria, for those of you who don't know, is the powerhouse of the cell. But you might encounter news on the newspaper. Maybe you want to do a diet. Do you want to diet, and someone tells you that it favors the Krebs cycle? Oh, what is the Krebs cycle? Oh, yes, that has to do with the mitochondria, doesn't it? So it is applying specific knowledge to specific context. And to me, that's the most similar thing to life itself. I repeat, we started with the subject of biology, and the process is not over yet. It still needs broadening considerably. We're only just starting to apply this knowledge to diverse contexts. But there are much more, I was going to say important aspects, but just as important, which is the critical thinking, the personal positioning of being able to relate different information together to see which is real and which is not. In the digital world, in the global world, or through the internet, through Google, you can find about 1,000 websites, out of which 990 spout nonsense and 10 are saying things that are right on point. Well, you need to be able to discern and discriminate. And this discrimination, for me, needs to be part and parcel. This critical ability to discriminate that needs to be present not only in biology, but to every other subject from primary school. Because this is something that can't be just changed overnight when we reach high school or whatever. You need to start in primary school, and it is already being done, and it needs to be maintained throughout secondary education, high school, and obviously needs to be continued in university. So for me, we need to have this positioning. How do we want university to be? And therefore, how do we want high school to be? And how do we want to be all the prior stages to be? How do we want primary school to be so that secondary school is also that way, and high school is also that way, and university is also that way? Because that is how we want society to be. And behind me, for me, there's a clear social position. And everything that I'm saying here, I could justify based on how the brain works, which is my field of expertise. Explain, for instance, why any learning that has a social component will be integrated by the brain much, much better. That doesn't mean that it learns more. It just means that it uses these things more efficiently, which brings us to collaborative learning, as has been said by the previous panelists. All that are part and parcel of a person. And so in a way, this transition between mandatory education, high school and university needs to be that way. It needs to be made sufficiently evident that someone has not only learned specific concepts, but also has learned ways to apply them. It has learned to think critically. And so we put him on the way of autonomous thinking, to compare and make decisions independently. I mean, deciding what studies, what degree you want to pursue is a wild decision when perhaps you haven't been able to make many important decisions before that. So this is a whole process that, to me, is crucial to soften some of the things we are currently encountering. I tutor a group of 30 students of the biology degree. That's the 4th time doing it. We take them in the first year and drop them at in year 4 to pick up a new group, even though some of them remain for 1 extra year. And the most common questions are, the fact that they're more frequent doesn't mean that it's the majority, but beyond silly questions of like, how can I sign up for 2 credits? I don't know, just go to the secretary's office. But beyond that, it's, I don't know if I chose right the degree that I wanted to study. I'm in my 2nd year, and if I switch, I will have lost 2 years. Instead of saying, well, maybe you've gained some knowledge. Life is long. If you realize that biology is not your calling and you want to do philosophy, everything you've learned so far will stay with you. But this is life learning. This is learning that should start in the beginning of education. Obviously, there ought to be more flexible mechanisms to switch degrees. That's besides the question. But that feeling of purpose of everything that is done, and for me, that is one of the issues with university entrance exams, because it looks like they're the be-all end-all. You got 12.2, so you can't do this. Oh, but you got 12.21, so you can. And these tests, for the most part, are not competence-based, but they should be. So these, in broad terms, is what I wanted to say. I'm guessing with the questions we might get to the finer points. Well, I will try to focus a lot more on university selection, because otherwise I will go off topic, and that'd be a dreadful thing, because I do that surprisingly easily. It is true that there are benefits to objectivity, but if it's objectivity to measure something that is of no interest, then what do we want it for? Like he said, test-based exams, multiple choice tests. If you ask me the same question 80 times, I will always answer the same. And my answers are going to be obviously objective, but is it going to be more profound, more interesting? I don't think so. I think we need to speak about objectivity in more relative terms, but I also think it's very important, and it's an amazing amount of work that they've done, which is working on what other evidence can we bring to the table for people to make their own decisions. We know that universities want to capture a specific kind of person, and they would be delighted to have better information. But there's a problem on how to manage it and how to produce that information. Something they've done which is amazing is to produce this body of evidence on what their students are able to do through their high school education. So this is continuous work of everything from the thoughts that a student has had on a book. They will themselves choose what the student has done for 2 or 3 years. What part of that work is it worth for someone else to look at, to certify, to attest, to vet what they're able to do? And I think that this kind of efforts is what we all should start to do. So we can go to universities and say that let's have this pilot trial. And also, what kind of evidence can we really put on the table, which will be between this objectivity, which obviously will not be such because everyone will be handing in different work. But if you have a committee of people assessing, they will all agree that this is a student that we're interested in, which ultimately is, if we put the subjectivities of many different people together to look at the student's work, we'll see that we agree a lot more than we will if we just start thinking on whether an exam reflects whether we're interested in that student or not. So I think that the way to break away from the immobility of this university entrance exam is problematic, not just around the world. Have university admissions based on standardized testing is a problem. Obviously, international high schools have this sort of in-between assessment, but if you look at what they do with their grades, it's not standardized testing. For each of the subjects, there's an internal assessment on this, there's a process of thought on how you reach this, there's like a million different pieces that are very similar to the experience in New York, but that they have somehow aggregated into figures for those who don't want to read through all the work and sort of have an idea of where the student is at. But maybe this is a way to start to generate a body of evidence, to create committees that allow us to offer a grade, or maybe let's ask universities to start reading all this information to consider whether this is a pilot that they want to get started. I think we need to make the effort of producing that body of evidence in the schools to hand it over to the universities and then have these pilot tests. Because otherwise, we run the risk, and I agree that we were saying one of the advantages of COVID is that these exams have disappeared. But the same way they have disappeared, schools that didn't have a way to prove have found that, gosh, they don't even have their SAT. So how can I prove, if you haven't done all the work that they have done, how can I prove that this kid is really good? So in the end, what universities are asking for is recommendation letters and to write an essay. And who has the money to get money for someone to tutor them to write these essays? Or who has been taught in school to write this essay? Which ultimately, there's an expertise that you get in certain schools, and whereas in other schools you don't even work on it because you either do the SATs or you knew it was irrelevant work. So what we have also encountered is that universities that did away with the exams realized that they have ended even being more discriminatory because they had to make decisions based on letters written by people who already were very polished in writing these letters. So the system wasn't quite equitable. So what we need is for the schools to train people the way they're being trained in New York schools and produce this body of evidence to support us being able to prove that these children must go to university. And so what I am keeping after following Anne for years, I am so happy to see the results of this pilot, that we can finally have these figures, because true, some people will only believe this kind of evidence. But I was very happy when they started building these bridges towards universities, when they went to universities and said, let's do this pilot test. Here's the evidence. Tell me why you don't want these students. Dare to take just a few, start with 30. It's such an intelligent way to have this transition, because you produce the entire evidence, you make sure you're training people, go to universities, ask for a reduced pilot test, and it's the universities themselves that will want to broaden the pilot. We already have a success story that, for myself personally, motivates me to get it started here right now. So I don't know what we're waiting for, really.
Suggestion is that relatively quickly react to some of the comments that both Alvaro and Caterina made, and luego podemos abrir.
And then we can open up the floor to those of you that have questions or comments, and we'll just take it as it comes.
Just to say about the last speaker that there has been some real shifts at the university that occurred even before COVID. That the university, dropped their resistance to student work. They now accept student work. They accept recommendations from teachers. And they've even decided that the math placement test, which they were using to reroute students that were accepted, back to the two-year colleges, they actually dropped the math because we asked them to try putting the kids in regular math classes to see what happened. And when they all did well, they gave up on the placement test. So there have been some shifts. Whether they stay in place is a question. I mean, COVID pushed a lot of colleges that were already, before COVID, there were already about 1,200 to 1,400 colleges and universities throughout the United States that are what called test optional now. Those are schools that have moved away from using the SAT or the ACT for entrance. So that's a good sign. And city universities, big universities like California and New York were very resistant because they had such enormous numbers. But actually now they have put in place to keep it going for a couple of years, and they're going to look and see how it works. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I think that that's a good sign. So there have been some shifts, and I think that there's a general, I don't want to be overly optimistic, but I think that we're beginning to see some cracks in the testing industry, in the testing approach. People are beginning to think maybe that's not a good way, and certainly not the major way. And we actually, I think, have some solutions to this. There is, in the United States, something called the NAEP, which is the National Education Assessment, that's done every 4 years. And the virtue of the NAEP is that it's a sampling test. And I think that's a really important trend that we should push. Sampling is a very good way. Gallup uses it all the time. They use it 1,500 people across the country, demographically selected, and they come up with, oh, the United States people think such and such. Well, in education, they do it now every 4 years. It's not a test that every child takes, so it doesn't involve schools spending hours and hours and a lot of money retesting and retesting and retesting. It's really designed to take the temperature of the schools across the country. So I think that's hopeful. I think we need more of it. There's a proposal for Congress to start what they call grade span testing. This is what Finland does, once in elementary, once in middle, and once in high school. I'm a little bit less happy about that because I think that even that will drive the curriculum and instruction, knowing that your school at some point is going to be, grades 1 to 4 or in grades 5 through 8 are going to be judged by a single test. So I'm a little reluctant to get on that bandwagon. But I think there are some progress, and not everything we want, but some. I want to respond to IB, the IB Baccalaureate, the International Baccalaureate. It's not, I don't think that we have much in common, actually. It's a test, it's a curriculum. It's set by a board. It's a set curriculum, which is actually not what we do. We want teachers to develop the curriculum, and we want teachers to develop assessments, and we want kids to be involved in that process. And I think that Michelle can probably speak more to that because she's actually looked at some of the IB programs, at least as far as New York is concerned. The final thing I want to say is that I'm not convinced yet that using an alternative to testing is more expensive. I think that's a kind of, it's sort of like it's an immediate answer to but the testing industry is $1 billion industry, at least in the United States. They are making a fortune, and I want to say it's all tests. I'm talking about the College Board that is supposed to be nonprofit they decided they had to give up on the SAT because a lot of schools are not using it. They haven't gone away. They've substituted AP exams. AP exams are exams in a particular subject that are set by the College Board, and the test is set by the College Board. And I don't understand, I know parents think that it's a kind of litmus test for rigor. But I think you can also develop in your schools courses that have rigor and excitement and engagement. And what we've tried to do is create a board of college professors who can look at what the syllabus looks like in courses that you're offering, and those courses can be given the same honor that AP courses would be given. And I think we have made it a political football. In New York, the mayor, and not this mayor, but the previous mayor, announced that every school was going to have 5 AP exams. Just utter nonsense. So the kids are pushed into these courses. They don't end up taking the exams. If they took them, they wouldn't do well. And it would be yet another way of the College Board making a fortune on kids taking these tests. So I think we have to look seriously at every time they want to reintroduce some kind of instrument. We have to pay attention to what is that instrument actually asking kids. Is it asking kids what they know and can do? No, it's asking them to tell them what somebody else thinks they should know. And I think you have to look at the design of the tests. All tests have knocked out, at least in New York and around the country, they do field testing. So they figure out which questions some kids can't answer and which tests some kids can. Who are the kids that can answer the questions and who are the kids who can't? Frankly, it's always the same kids. You can determine how kids are going to do on most of these tests by looking at their postal code. Where do they live? How much money do the parents make? What experiences, life experiences have they had? I don't need to have a test to tell me that. So I think we need to be a lot more discerning, a lot more child-centered, a lot more focused on what it is that we want to know. What do we really want to find out? And then design some ways to tell us that.
Més preguntes, intervencions?
Any more questions, comments, ideas? I am creating this classic moment of silence.
But lo siento por inglés. Lo siento por mi país. So I'm apologizing for English. 3 quick comments. First, it's really fun to have a brain guy on our side. It's interesting, in the beginning when biologists started getting involved, I was a little worried, and now I've seen a whole stream of biology, neuropsychology folks who are really thinking about learning and assessment in ways that are inquiry-based, understand that the social, the emotional are associated with the cognitive. So welcome home. The second is, you asked, I loved what you all said, but you asked what's the obligation of the university? Or you asked what's the role? And I would say, what's the obligation? In a world where we are destroying our planet, where authoritarianism and fascism is on the rise, where democracy is on the decline, where inequities are swelling, we have an obligation to think through who we are educating, how we are educating, and how we are assessing what constitutes learning. And I'm with Anne. Every time we collect data, we have to think, why, for what? Is this about exclusion, or is this about reintegration? And in our country, all this testing is about stratification and exclusion. That's expensive. Right? Inclusion isn't necessarily more expensive. One of my ideas was to have a course between Chile, Barcelona, and New York of teachers on Zoom really talking about the practice of performance-based work, right? What are the dilemmas? What are the opportunities? Friends of mine did an indigenous language course between New Zealand, Alaska, Australia, one other country, and the US with indigenous language. And they had to meet at 2 in the morning or something to work. But it would be really beautiful to name this a movement for education and democracy, and engage a kind of transnational conversation of practitioners and allied social scientists and communities. And I'm with you, Katerina. If we all start with a little humble pilot that grows out of decades of knowledge and bearing witness, and we stitch those together, That's how movements occur. And my last point is on objectivity. So I don't want to call that objectivity, right? In our country, people pay a lot of money for kids to get prepped to take those tests. And in our country, if you have certain kinds of doctors saying you have a disability, you get extended time. In our country, if you have a parent who went to that university, it doesn't matter. So I'm not willing to concede that that's objective. There's a feminist philosopher, Sandra Harding, who talks about strong objectivity. And what strong objectivity is having very differently positioned people come together to put all of our biases or perspectives in a pot and together to craft a question, gather evidence, and analyze that evidence. So it's a pluralistic version of objectivity rather than confusing distance or standardization as objectivity. I think that version of objectivity only reproduces colonial systems that have privileged some at the expenses of others. But thank you all. That was just really gorgeous.
Thank you. ¿Alguna pregunta, reacción? Andaban.
Maybe the Catalans can talk about the university access exam, the selectividad, as it is now, because I don't know if this exam in Spain is as exclusive as it has been said of other standardized tests, or does it just putting some order? Because at the end of the day, 90% of the students that take the exam pass it. So if you could talk about this a little bit. And David, with regards to what has been said about how after the year, I think it was 2024, this exam is going to be strictly competence-based. Do you think that is going to be the case? Shall we have one last round with your reactions, and then we'll switch panels? I will be answering the first question. For reasons that now are not important, we tried to take school grades and see if they predict university entrance exam grades. Because in a way, what that exam strives to do, or claims to do, is to measure objectively what's going down in the school. And we tried to, with COVID, see if the results of the exams could somehow be forecast. And we looked at the subjects that were being studied in schools and if they predicted how a student would test in that exam of that same subject. And something that really left me speechless was that the value of the grade, the highest predictive of how well a student would do throughout the exam, was English. And English, I would say it's the subject that if you do learn English, it's not in school. It reflects what's being done at home. And to me, that was evidence that all the preparations don't really have to do with knowledge. I was surprised that it wasn't reflected in school grades. Because that's what I was using, because if you have support at home, your grades will get better as a result. But beyond school grades, there's something that directly correlates to your ability to respond to a situation like university entrance exams. Pressure, very standardized questions, which in certain environments you may have been specifically prepared to answer those kind of questions. So unfortunately, in the US, but really anywhere in the world, and Catalonia as well, this exam is really informed by the family environment. And there's a little thing that is also very interesting, which in underprivileged circumstances, students systematically perform worse given school grades. So the forecast is always that you'll do worst in the standardized testing if you come from an underprivileged background, and also if you're a girl, interestingly enough. But I said that's a different matter entirely. But if we have the way to capture heterogeneity that wasn't socio-economical like in the US, we'd be encountering the same thing. So I think the question clearly is yes, unfortunately, yes. Just one last thing. It's true that selection is not based on a pass-fail, but on whether your grade will allow you to get into a specific degree or not. So it's not just passing or failing, it's what grade you get. So it does certainly exclude people from certain degrees. I mean, that it's not exclusive because 90-something% pass the test. But to me, what that means is that schools prepare them very well for those exams. So they know what exams they'll do, and so they get taught based on that. In the case of biology, for instance, we have a website that I maintain. It's ugly because I can't really do, IT is not my forte, but we have exams from the past 20 years. So that's at least 3 exams, 3 different tests each year, 6 questions, 6 exams, and all the rubrics. So you can explain all the biology that is taught in high school just by using these exams. Obviously, if you do that, you're training them very well for this kind of test. And this is the same for every other subject. Clearly, what that means is that students have learned, and no, they're just well trained. So it really depends on each teacher, each education professional, how they can make them think and help them mature. With regards to the future, well, 2024, as the curriculum is right now, it says it has to be competence-based, but the former curriculum said the same. It's a different matter entirely whether we believe it. We need to socially believe that everything needs to be competence-based from kindergarten, because it can't be. I mean, it could, but it's already competence-based. But all the way to the end of university, master's degrees, postgraduates, everything ought to be competence-based. But we need to believe in it. And secondly, those of us who are in teaching need to know how to do it. Because we have this momentum that comes from a very long time ago. I mean, those of us who work in education have a problem, and you'll excuse me for talking out the brain right now, but we're the only profession who has co-lived with our profession since we have our first memories. We have all gone to school, and we don't remember just what we were taught, but how we were taught. And when the time comes for us to teach, no matter how much we know that there are other ways to do things, our brain uses all this accrued knowledge. So if we got taught on a non-competence-based, memory-based approach with the fear of not passing the exams, and for those of us of a certain age, were ridiculed if you made a mistake, instead of letting mistake be a source of learning, mistakes were a source of embarrassment in class. It's not that we do that anymore, but it's really hard for us to make this shift. So there's a lot of work to do there in terms of models, training, something that makes it possible to see that this is possible. It is definitely possible. And you were saying, well, what do you think? You were speaking directly to me. I mean, the brain obviously produces a lot of endorphin, serotonin, and dopamine, because I'm very optimistic. To me, the glass is always half full and rose-tinted. And optimism biases all colors towards pink. There are scientific studies that prove that. So I think we're definitely on the right track. We will get to where we want to arrive, where I want to get, hopefully by 2024. I just wanted to thank you again for the invitation, Eduard, and thank the audience for their kindness. I know it's getting late. and obviously Michelle and Anne for their explanations and their responses. So I'll pick up the glove and say that I am at your entire disposition. I'll be more than happy to share experiences with you and create this transnational movement. So count on us. Thank you so much to everyone. Since it's getting late, we will get the general director of the University Council, and the minister will speak from where they are. They suggested they do that. So suit yourselves. We're not being inconsiderate here. Good evening. Can you hear me? Since we were called on to speak now, I just wanted to say 3 or 4 things. Eduard was asking, well, what do you think about this? And also because we were directly spoken to. What I see is a great risk, the way society is going, that testing permanence will end up being determining, not just for prior educational institutions, but of learning processes. What is learned and how? And so with Michelle's comment just now, if we keep into account the world that lies ahead of us and the challenges that lie ahead of us with regards to energy shortage, prime material shortage, democracy is deteriorating, if we don't learn these goals and processes of learning, this will become a threat rather than an opportunity, and we need to make education into a key factor for opportunity. So basically what we say, if we evolving tests goes well beyond tests, but what is the world that we are building? And I think that is also has a lot to do with what the last report of UNESCO said, and this is something that we have discussed at large with Eduard. I am convinced that the only question is, how do we bring about that change? And it's not easy because we need to change the entire system. And with institutions and administrations that aren't exactly designed to spearhead change. Our administrations have a highly vertical structure, and they're accustomed to simple, generalized changes in accordance to great plans. And this kind of changes need to be done gradually and motivating new changes very well. So having this great act of all changes by a specific amount, by a specific time, no matter what, which is the situation where we are at right now, this will only bring us to make changes to fulfill what was on the law and not to answer to the challenges ahead of us. And some of the levers for change that I think are important, well, it's not news to anyone that the orders that regulate the university access exams come from Madrid. It's 5 high school subjects that need to be tested, and they set the basis on how structurally these tests need to be made. So any process, even of a pilot test, if we were to do a pilot with less testing, it should all be approved by Madrid. And I mean, we do have some things in our favor, the experience of assessment that are competence-based, which is a methodology that we're already using to understand how within high school we are able to assess based on competences, which is something that's already being done for every subject. And that is the necessary condition for all of this to work. And we also need, what should I call it, a coalition or critical mass of schools and teachers that support this demand and help us not just place this demand, but to keep building on the proposal on how this needs to be articulated, because the administration by itself, they might say yes, but oftentimes we need that critical mass of ideas to keep building in that direction. but the essence is how could be the competence-based assessment in high school? And with regards to that kind of exams, we have a good experience. When it comes to learning processes that are strictly competence-based and project-based, we don't have that many schools, but we do have some good examples. So that's a good starting point. And lastly is how do we start is that maybe a group of schools could lead the way in a pilot test, and it's a matter of seeing how to structure this. And so I know this is now based on very abstract ideas, but I think we have the necessary conditions to discuss this. So that's all for me. Well, going off of what you've all been saying and what Joan has said, we are only a part of the picture that comes from the institutions and the most political part, so to speak. And we need this cross-sectional, transdisciplinary vision. But that's what needs to help us to look at all these processes through the different points of view that participate in it. It would not be very useful to deploy strategies that were only based on political views, or only on administrative views, or only on one particular position. And I think that Joan and I sort of mean to represent this way of working that is necessarily cross-sectional and transdisciplinary, that includes different points of view. And from the Department of Education and the Department of Research and universities, we will try. And this is what we believe and what we preach. What is the good thing about the system that we have right now? I think it was Victor who was asking, and what are university access exams right now? And I respect for everyone. I try not to even call it selectivity, because it's not a selective process. It's a process that, as Victor was saying, it puts some order. And we were saying, what's the good thing about the system that we have right now? Because it does have some good thing and some positive things that maybe with some nuance and with some assessment and with some revisions, we mustn't lose. Right now, there are three things that are very important. One is that they're anonymous. They're anonymous, and we believe that this is relevant and valuable, that access to university is done anonymously, based exclusively, for now, on merit and academic prowess of a student. And it doesn't take other elements into account, and maybe it should. The other thing is that the system, that it allows to put some order, to order students according to their preferences with regards to what they would like to study. In the model that we choose, that we are following, the current testing, future testing, what's going to happen next week or in 2024, these three elements we need to consider them institutionally at the core of the system to access university in the 12th Catalan university. Let's not forget that Catalonia has 12 universities. There's obviously a lot of room for improvement. That testing is competence-based. Well, it already is. In the wake of what David started 18 years ago, 12, okay, well, he's been in 12, but he's been working on this for over 15 years. Has been followed by 90% of the testing that is now university access tests. It's another matter entirely whether all questions and all exams are exclusively competence-based. Well, we clearly agree that there's room for improvement there. But I invite you that besides David's website, you enter the Catalan government website for university ministry, where you can download the tests from the 10 previous years, because then you will see how competence-based they are right now. Because that's what Joan was saying also, university entrance exams. don't just depend on university, which is the ones who have the competences to admit students. Let's not forget that in Catalonia, the power to admit students into universities belongs to the universities. It doesn't belong to the administration, not to the Catalan government. It's the Catalan universities, all 12 of them, who together coordinate to make university admission into a coordinated system. And that is something that universities task on the administration. I'm sorry, there's 1,000 things I could say. But the legal framework that we have right now does not allow to admit students as they see fit. This is something also to know and to keep in mind. Right now, university entrance tests do look at the grades in high school. They're not thought to look at university, they're done to evaluate high school. And this testing being used that temporarily was used to evaluate high school. And starting in 2016, university access exams, evaluation for university access, is legally defined as an assessment of high school with the goal of ordering students, putting them in order for their access to university. So clearly there's room and need for agreement on how do we want these tests to be. Because right now what they do is assess high school, and they look at high school. And not just because we have this university access testing that don't look at high schools. And I have an example for the equity that this can have, which is access to university for people older than 25, older than 40. And these are tests that also put order and also have the goal of allowing access to university, but that don't come with this curriculum behind it. And that's the thing that sets them apart, that they do have a curriculum behind it. And we do have plenty of examples. I mean, we will not stop making efforts. Catalonia, for instance, doesn't have the power to decide how they want university access exams to be. Universities don't have that power either. We have some best practices which help us, and we have many open fronts. So there's a lot of work to be done. Thank you. Yes, indeed. We have a lot of work. And the goal of this site event was precisely showing how changes in the way to measure learning hugely impact secondary education, the access of people from underprivileged backgrounds to university, and creating a real merit-based filter. And then with its maintenance, it can be visualized that there's greater merit. It can be measured. We've also seen with these three examples from different academic views. We've seen the elephant in the room, which is that basically in every system, there's something that works since the dawn of time, and no one dares to change it because they're afraid that if we change it, it's all going to go up in ashes. But the reality, as we were hearing from Chile and from New York, is that this is only a matter of time. There will come a time when we will finally have someone in government who will say, we need to know what we want to measure. And what we want to measure will determine what people are going to learn in secondary education and in university. Thank you so much, Secretary Director. Thank you, Alvaro, David, Catarina. Thank you, Maria. And thank you, everyone, for your huge patience. And good night. Thank you.